So in this third ecology video, these are the two syllabus statements that we're focusing on. 4.8 we've touched on already, and what I want you to appreciate here is that when we eat food, we are eating food for nutrition, and I wanted to tie all that in to what we've already learned about balanced diet and about digestion. But in principle, when we're talking about ecology, we're mostly interested in the transfer of energy. And what I also want you to appreciate is that the mass of an organism, or the biomass of an organism, is stored chemical energy. So if you eat, you are taking in stored chemical energy. And we're also going to touch on this syllabus statement in red. Now, take care when you meet this in an exam scenario, because you might think that you understand it, but sometimes it's a very frequent mistake. When students articulate this understanding, they write things down which are incredibly misleading. So you have to make sure that when you're communicating about the loss of energy as it moves from one trophic level to the next, that you are very, very tight with your language. So I want to start by you pausing the video in a moment, going into the Google Classroom and just watching this video. Now, he's going to take you through most of what you need to know. Then I'd like you to come back here, and I'd like to underscore a few points and hopefully embed that understanding with a little bit more detail. So let's think about energy transfer along the food chain. We know that the source of energy for most of the ecological systems is in the form of solar energy. So light energy allows the plant to do photosynthesis. The producer, the photosynthetic organism, then takes in that light energy, and it's allowing it to convert carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrate. And from carbohydrate, we can form all sorts of other molecules like proteins and lipids. So we're building up tissue in the producer by doing autotrophic nutrition, by doing photosynthesis. And what we need to appreciate is that we've got locked in here what is referred to as gross primary productivity. So let's think about what that actually means. And I want to skip down a few slides here and jump back and forth. So we need to think about, what do we mean by productivity? So productivity in ecology looks at the rate at which we can increase the biomass, because the biomass is essentially the potential chemical energy. Bio is living, mass means tissue. So we've got all the living tissue. If we can increase that living tissue, we increase the productivity. And very often, and when we come back to look at human influences in year 11, we're going to come back to this idea of productivity in crops. So we want to increase the productivity in plants, which then means that we've got an increase in energy flow through an ecosystem. So in plants, what we need to appreciate is that if we've got more biomass, we've got more chemical energy. So biomass is really, we can use it interchangeably with this idea of energy. So the more mass, the more energy. And in terms of productivity in plants, we need to think of gross productivity and net productivity. And in plants, I want us to think first of all about gross primary productivity. Now, the primary just refers to the fact that we are talking about the producer. So the gross primary productivity, or GPP. This is when light hits the plant and then light is converted into chemical energy. We've got a mass, which is going to be our gross primary productivity. But the plant needs some energy for its own life processes. And because it needs energy for its own life processes, there is going to be some energy lost. So what's available to be passed on to the herbivore is a smaller quantity of energy, which is referred to as the net primary productivity, or NPP. And the NPP is basically the gross primary productivity, how much was locked in from doing photosynthesis. And you need to take away that the energy which is lost by the plant by doing its own regular metabolic processes and maintenance. So if we go back up here, we've got light falling on the plant, and that locks in what we refer to as gross primary productivity. But then the plant doing its own plant stuff is going to lose some energy, so there's less available to be passed along to the herbivore in this case here. And in addition to that, we need to consider that most of the energy that's lost is going to be in the form of heat. Now, let's just break down that difference between the gross and the net by thinking about where the energy is being lost. And I want us to think about Mrs. H. Gren, and I've deliberately bolded up the red one here, which I'll come back to. So we know that we take in energy which is required for our life processes. And if we're using it for our life processes, it's not going to increase our biomass. And if it's not going to increase our biomass, it can't be available to be passed along to the next trophic level. So if you think of a plant is going to do photosynthesis. So N, it's going to do photosynthesis. It's going to make organic material. And then some of that organic material is going to be involved in respiration. And when the plant does respiration, it's going to produce ATP, and the ATP is going to get used up. It's not available to be passed on. In addition, when you do respiration, and this includes plants, heat is going to be generated, and that heat is not available to be passed on. So I want us to think about this idea that when all organisms, not just plants, but all organisms need to do respiration, and heat energy is lost when cells do respiration, which is not available to be passed along. So we can see here, heat. So when this organism does respiration, it's going to lose some energy as heat from doing respiration. It's therefore not available to be passed on to the bird. Similarly, if the plant is doing respiration, you're going to get heat loss from respiration, which means it's not available to be passed along to the caterpillar or the herbivore in this case. In addition, let's consider M, movement. If organisms are moving around and locomoting, if animals are moving around, they're going to use up some energy, which is therefore not available to be passed along. Plants can do movement. They do small growth movements, which are referred to as phototropic movements or geotropic movements, which we will come back to when we're back at school. But plants can also do movement. So if a plant is moving, it's going to be losing energy. If a plant is doing respiration, it's going to be losing energy in the form of heat. If a plant is showing sensitivity, it's going to be using up energy. And it is sensitive. We go back to homeostasis. We know that plants are sensitive because we can open and close the stomata dependent on whether or not we're losing too much water by transpiration. So there's energy involved in the opening and closing of the stomata, which is sensitivity and homeostasis as an example in plants. Reproduction, when plants produce the pollen and when plants produce the egg for reproduction, they are using up energy in the process of making those gametes, and therefore they're losing energy which is not available to be passed on. When plants are doing excretion, that is, remember to define the difference between excretion and egestion. Excretion is getting rid of waste which is made in the cells. So we've got cells doing all sorts of chemical processes, including plants, including animals, including fungi, including bacteria. All of them have this metabolic process that is going to make some excretory material, and the excretory material is not available to be passed along the food chain. So if we go and look at this organism doing its thing is going to only be able to pass on 10% of its energy, because most of it is going to be lost and is not available to be passed on because it's doing its own life processes. Same here, because it's doing its own life processes, it's going to lose some energy which is not available to be passed along. So just be careful with this idea of heat loss. Heat energy is lost when cells do respiration. This is another sort of related idea, that not all biomass can be eaten by consumers. So if you've got a herbivore eating a plant, it might eat the surface part of the plant, but it's not necessarily going to eat the roots. It might eat the leaves, but it's not going to eat the bark of the tree. Similarly, if we've got animals are going to eat other animals. They're carnivores, and those carnivores are going to eat other animals, and they're going to eat the meat. They're not necessarily going to eat the bones or the fur that's associated with it. So not all biomass is consumable. And the other thing to consider is that when we eat food, in order for us to make use of it, we need to digest it, we need to absorb it, and we then need to take it to our cells, and our cells need to assimilate it. So tie in your ideas with what we know about digestion. So not everything we eat, we know that when we eat fiber, we cannot break down fiber. So fiber is lost in the form of feces. It's egested material. Remember, this is different because this is waste that was created from undigested material, not waste that's created by our body cells. So we've got egested material which is being lost, which is not available to be passed along to the next stage of the food trophic level of the food chain, and we've got excreted material, which we just spoke about. You need to be a little bit careful with this G, because if an organism is using energy for growth, yes, it's going to lose a little bit of energy for growing, because that growth requires the utilization of energy. But if the organism is growing, it's got more biomass, and therefore it's got more energy to be passed along. So we know we're going to have heat loss from respiration. We know that when the plant gets eaten by the herbivore might not eat all of the plant. Therefore, we've got a loss in energy being transferred. We know also that it might be able to eat some parts of the plant, but not necessarily digest, absorb, and assimilate. So you've got egested material, which is lost, and excreted material, which is lost. So this is only transferring 10% of the energy at each stage, which means that as we go along the food chain, there's more and more energy cumulatively being lost. So food chains are rarely more than 4 or 5 organisms that are long, 4 or 5 organisms long. So let's just touch on this idea of models again. And what we want to appreciate is that you've got an indication here of energy. So you've got the producer's got this much energy locked into its body. So we've got the gross primary productivity, but then it's going to lose some of its energy by doing its own life processes. So the net primary productivity that's passed on is less, and we've got only 10% of the energy that's being passed along. And again, only 10% of the energy that's passed along, only 10%. So we're going down an energy gradient. So energy is being lost at each stage. And what we can do is we can look at an ecosystem and take all of the producers and work out what the productivity of all of the producers are collectively. We can calculate the productivity of all the primary consumers, etc., etc. And if we map this out as a pyramid of energy, this pyramid of energy is pyramid shaped because energy is going to be lost at every single trophic level. So ecological models includes pyramids, and these are basically graphical representations showing the flow of energy from the food chain, and it gets lower as you go up the food chain. If we consider this diagram, we can see that there are different pyramids, and pyramid of energy is the most accurate, it's the most usable, and this one always is going to be pyramid shaped because you're always going to lose energy as you go along the food chain. If we look at pyramids of biomass, sometimes pyramids of biomass can be really weird shapes. For example, if we look at this biomass here, we can see that we've got grass, rabbit, fox, and it's got that pyramid shape that we would expect because the biomass here, the biomass here is always going to be greater and more energy. Energy is being lost, there's going to be less biomass, etc., etc. Here, what we've got is an aquatic system where we've got some phytoplankton. These are algae, single-celled algae, which live in the water, but these will sometimes, at certain parts of the year, decrease, which means that you've got this weird shaped pyramid just here. So sometimes they're going to be unusual shape if you're looking at pyramid of biomass in certain times, in certain ecologies. If we look at pyramids of number, these are really rubbish because these are assuming that all organisms, if you've got a single grass species, then a single grass species here, if we look at collectively, there's lots of numbers which are going to make sure that we've got this here. But if we look at phytoplankton, or if you look at something like an oak tree example, which is in your textbook, you can see that this idea of pyramids of numbers is not representing energy, therefore it's pretty useless. So what I would like you to do now is to just check that you actually can inwardly digest this by trying out pages 10 to 14 of your booklet. There's one more slide to screen up before I stop, and that's some definitions that you might want to take down and you might want to make use of.